If you want to make your way to Nehemiah, I had to pull a old man moment and print out today a larger font for some of this that I'm going to have to read in Nehemiah. My good old-fashioned hardback copy here needs to be upgraded to one of those real big fat ones with the mega print. Um, we've invited you guys to pray as you're making your way to Nehemiah chapter 4. Our timeline, is being delayed as we move into that permanent ministry space over there where that awesome sign was put up this weekend. And we're just continuing to invite you guys to pray around the obstacles that we're facing around this children's building situation. We know God will provide. He'll blow our minds as he always has and always will do in his perfect timing. But we're just continuing to ask you all to join us in prayer as we seek his provision in that. And we'll be updating you on timelines and all that kind of stuff as soon as we can. And that's also the purpose in that March 3rd meeting that you heard Chase announce. So exciting days, but it reminds me, Nehemiah chapter 4 is this week. I pray and hope that God uses this chapter in your heart, and I believe he will. But I felt so much this week like this was all for me, that every bit of it was for me. It's that phrase, we've all heard it, when it rains, it pours, right? When it rains, it pours. I remember one moment, this was years ago, it was one of the many that lodged into my brain that I would never forget. I was going to a meeting with someone. It was a church member at that time, years ago, no longer here. Don't look around the room trying to figure out who it was. They had requested some time with me. And there's ways that people request time with me that throws up different flags. There's ways that they ask that it's like, oh, I know what's coming here. Or I know how this is going to go, or I can't wait for this one, right? I mean, there's just different things. When you've been doing this as long as I have, you sort of learn the signals to it. And so I arrived at this particular discussion, coffee shop meeting, and it didn't take long, wasn't a sip or two of coffee to realize that the topic of this particular meeting was feedback on my preaching. And I don't mind feedback at all. I'm being honest with you. I don't wear my feelings on my sleeve. I welcome feedback. I welcome critique. And even the kinds that sometimes seem the most outrageous, I've learned over the years that there's something I can learn from it. Right? No matter what. There's always something I can take, and I can pull and learn something. This particular meeting, though, for different reasons, was just hard for me. It was a season, when it rains, it pours, right? It was a season in my life where there's these health struggles and issues going on, and my fuse was already short, and I go to this meeting, and we engage, in this discussion, and I just kind of received the feedback, and it was hard. I left, and I walked out of that, just feeling a little bit defeated. And I get to my car, parked outside, and I'm just ready to get out of there, You guys know the feeling. Just ready to go on, get back to the office, get home. And so I get in, and the car decides not to respond to my movement of the key. I sat there and I tried again. Nothing happens. Car's not going to start. I'm used to driving older cars, so I don't freak out immediately, but I do have to stop and take a deep breath, right? Because I just came out of that meeting. I'm already a little short. Already feel a little hit a few times, metaphorically. I sit down, the car's not going to start. I take a deep breath, and I did something you should never do in these moments. Habitually, as many of you probably do as well, I have that moment, that pause, and so I open the email app on my phone. Email populates there, and sure enough, at the top of the list is an email from one of the doctor's offices that had done a recent surgical procedure begging for money from us. So I'm sitting there and came out of that meeting. Car's not going to start. Open up my email. See that email come through. And that moment, that 2-hour block, was a part of this bigger season of not only when it rains and it pours then amidst that 2 hours, but that was the story of life at that moment. When it rains, it pours. I know you guys have been there. You've been there in the small moments. It's those times during the day when you're going along and maybe it's a bad phone call and all of a sudden your coffee spills too. And it's these little things that happen that when it rains, it pours in life. Or other times it's the enormous things, right? Big things that happen in life, and all of it begins to snowball. It doesn't just happen in isolation. The car doesn't have a problem, and everything else in life is going perfectly. That's not the way it works. The air conditioner doesn't have a problem at home, and then everything else is going perfectly. It's always this storm of things. I shared with you a quote that I'll never forget from a friend of mine, and again, it was basically this: if you're questioning the will of God in a certain path of your life, and it's a more difficult one, then you're probably on the right path. There's a lot of truth to that. It's not something that's there for us to hang our hat on. It's not true all the time, but a lot of the time, it is. A lot of the time, it is. If you and I are living our lives as disciples, then we will experience opposition. We will. If we're living our lives as disciples, we will experience opposition. And so I'll just take a couple steps back, and we did a whole entire series on this, but I'll sum up that entire series in just a couple statements. A disciple of Jesus Christ is someone who says yes to the invitation, come and follow me. From Jesus. That's a disciple of Jesus. And he says, come and follow me. Someone who you've come to your place in life where you realize that I need more. I can't accomplish it. I've been looking for my purpose, and I've arrived thirsty every single day. I can't be good enough. We place our faith in Jesus, taking on, that sacrificial death that he gave, that we deserved. Having the opportunity to have this relationship with him, purchased by his victory over death. And we say yes to his invitation. Come follow me. We are disciples. There's not this latter step, point of arrival where you become a believer or you become a Christian and then you arrive at this place of disciple. But it's the moment we place our faith in him. And so as we wrestle with these ideas today, as a disciple, all of us in here, we will experience opposition. And that opposition takes all kinds of shapes. We'll see some of those shapes right here in chapter 4, but it takes all kinds of shapes and sizes. It can be our own sinfulness in life, part of that opposition. It can be the sinfulness of the world around us. It can be Satan himself. And I know when I say that, oftentimes it makes us nervous, right? All that hocus pocus. Satan, he exists, but we don't want to talk about him. We have it right here in our Bibles, right? And Paul says it. We don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. So we have examples of all these kinds of oppositions throughout this book. The opposition of our own sinfulness, our own process of getting to know Jesus. The opposition of the sinfulness around us, of the world, the opposition of evil and Satan himself. And so the myth is that being a follower of Jesus removes difficulty from our life. It's a myth that's spoken from pulpits and churches around the world. It's not true. It's not biblical. Being a follower of Jesus doesn't remove opposition. The truth is, when we're followers of Jesus and we place our faith in him and we say yes to that come and follow me invitation, then we have hope and purpose and joy, eternal purpose. We have healing. But we're not freed from opposition. Rather, we have a hope that's bigger than any opposition that can ever come against us. And so when we look at Nehemiah chapter 4, before we read a couple of these segments, I want to give you a little bit of background here so that you can maybe picture in your mind what Nehemiah is facing. This opposition here comes in 4 distinct groups, these names that you'll hear as we look at this. One was Sanballat from Samaria. Second is Tobiah of Ammon. And the third are the Arabs. And fourth is the men of Ashdod. And so geographically, if you can imagine with me for a moment, Samaria is to the north, Ammon to the east, Arabs to the south, Ashdod to the west. The opposition had formed a coalition literally surrounding Nehemiah. Geographically surrounding Nehemiah. So as he's hearing this and facing this is an enormous, seemingly insurmountable opposition that has risen up. You see, a fortified Jerusalem would have taken trade and commerce away from all of those surrounding areas. Jerusalem's walls had been down, and so all of this money, all of this wealth had been diverted to these surrounding regions. But now, if Nehemiah was able to do what he said he was going to do, then it would be brought back there within the walls. And so this opposition's highly motivated. They're politically motivated, right? They're financially, they're pridefully, they're even spiritually motivated, because Nehemiah made it no secret that he was there at the call of his God, and his God was going to bring success. So those that rise up to oppose him are motivated on all fronts. My son's soccer team, they were at practice one week. Every once in a while, they have these moments. The coaches are great. I think they know sometimes that the boys need, these are 4th and 5th grade boys, they need a mental break. And so sometimes we show up, and you can tell the motivation from the coaches is they just need to have fun. They just need to have fun today. It's not going to be all about the technical drills, and every time they mess up, they're going to run laps. And today's a day where we're just going to invest in them, and they're going to have fun. And so this was one of those days, but it may have backfired a little bit, because the have fun was that the 4th and 5th grade boys, my son's team, were going to scrimmage against the 7th and 8th grade girls. Now, think for a minute with me about the way that girls' timeline of maturity and growth compares to boys, right? So at 7th and 8th grade, these girls were they were tall. They had kind of gone through some growth spurts already. And then you have these 4th and 5th grade boys playing against them, and I was sitting there on the sideline watching, and it was literally like toddlers playing giants out there on the field. And the boys, mentally, it was so hard for them, because they would go and just brush against one of these girls, and it was like they were hitting against an oak tree. They would hit them, bam, hit the ground, rolling away for yards. And same thing with these girls. They figured it out before long, and I think they were getting a little bit too much joy out of it. They'd be running along and just give a little bump to these little bitty 60-pound boys, and there they'd go tumbling off the sideline. It was comical to watch, but I don't think it was as encouraging and fun for the boys that maybe the coach meant it to be. But that's where Nehemiah is at this moment. Opposition is huge. Giants surrounding him everywhere that he looks, every direction that he looks. Seemingly insurmountable. Moses leading the Israelites away from the Egyptian army. Remember? Insurmountable opposition. How in the world will this people get away from the Egyptian army? The Red Sea splits. Joshua's battles we read over and over again, right? Gosh, such an amazing book. So many movies that can be made from that book of the Bible. But here comes Joshua. Here comes his army fighting against these mighty men and these incredibly fortified cities. Seemingly insurmountable opposition. men who are called by God, just like Nehemiah, called by God, who faced opposition that appeared insurmountable. I think so many times you and I, when we find ourselves in situations, we think we're the first to get there. We find ourselves in difficulty in life. We find ourselves in this place of the snowball of opposition, that season of life of when it rains, it pours, whether it's marriage difficulty that's going on, and then all of a sudden there's a sprinkling of a health issue that comes right over the top to kind of ice the cake, per se. Or if it's a financial situation where things are tough and our minds are all on the right things of knocking out this debt, all the while the AC goes out and the car won't start. We find ourselves in these situations. When it rains, it pours, and then we think to ourselves that we're the only one, we're the first person to ever get there, and yet our Bibles are full of stories. Moses, Joshua, our friend Nehemiah here, who are people that are called by God, and they set out faithfully, responding to God, courageously, on this task of obedience, and yet they still face opposition that appears insurmountable. Maybe today, for you, maybe that's the biggest encouragement that you need to hear. What you're facing in life right now, that when it rains, it pours story that represents where you are, that snowball that's coming down the hill, that's just growing bigger and bigger, that you're in good company with Moses, with Joshua, with Nehemiah, and so many others through the Bible. You're not the first. You won't be the last. But it's the same God who comes to provide for you, the same God who gave victory to these men. If you look with me at Nehemiah chapter 4, I want to show you some things. We're going to read in some random spots here. You can follow with me. I'll help you kind of figure out where I'm reading. There's a pattern in chapter 4 that I want you to see. So first, I'm going to read in verse 1, we see that Sanballat, he heard that they were building the wall. He was angry and greatly enraged, and he jeered at the Jews. He said in the presence of his brothers in the army of Samaria, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish up in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish and burned ones at that?" In verse 3, Tobiah, he says, "Yes, what are they rebuilding? If a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall." In other words, they're not doing a good enough job to hold the weight of a fox. You continue looking down in verse 7. But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward, then in verse 8, they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion. You hear the opposition. In verse 10, in Judah, it was said, "The strength of those who bear the burdens is failing. There is too much rubble. By ourselves, we will not be able to rebuild the wall." In verse 11, our enemies said, "They will not know or see till we come among them and kill them and stop the work." There's two observations that I want to make as we look at this story and as we look at this opposition that comes against Nehemiah, comes against the people of God, comes against God's mission. And the first observation is that opposition comes with progress. Opposition comes with progress. I've watched all of my children. This is a children illustration / sports morning today. But I've watched all of them play on teams, all three of them. And what happens is when they get up against a team that's a lot worse than them, 9 times out of 10, they play down. They play horribly. It's not a good day. But then when I watch them either win or lose, play against a team that's much better than them, what happens 9 times out of 10 is that they play some of their best games of the season. Like I say, whether win or lose, they play up to the challenge, to the opposition that they're facing. And so when you and I, we read this and we ask the question in our lives, why God, when we're pursuing progress and when we're pursuing a vision for your name, his name, why must there be opposition? I've asked that question so many times in my life, my personal journey, going through seasons of life, and I feel like everything that I'm focused on is all about that big picture of giving our surrounding community an opportunity to have a growing relationship with Jesus Christ. And then opposition comes, and you can't help but ask, God, why? When this is the goal, when you're the goal, why opposition? I think the answer to that has to be because God knows exactly how to pull us on our knees in dependence of him. He knows exactly how to get us to that place where we must say, it's all about him. He did it all because I had nothing left to give. So when you're in that moment and you're asking that question, why God? The answer, 9 times out of 10, is because he's making himself bigger to you and everyone around you. I look back on those seasons of my life now and I see it. That's the challenge, hindsight, right? I look back on those seasons when I was crying out and asking and frustrated, and I look back now and I can see the way that God took his hands on the clay of my heart and molded it, changed it, grew my faith. And so now I can look back and I can answer that why question. I can say because God wanted to make himself known to me and those around me in ways that demanded that opposition at that time. The second observation as we read those words, opposition intensifies amidst vulnerability. Opposition intensifies amidst vulnerability. You see, what we read there, let me draw your attention back to it. Weakness is felt in verse 10. In Judah, it was said, the strength of those who bear the burdens is failing. And verse 11 is the first time that violence shows up in the opposition. Opposition intensifies amidst vulnerability. When it rains, it pours, right? That's the meaning of the phrase, is it snowballs. I loved the Rocky, I'll be honest, I still love the Rocky movies. When I was younger, I had a VHS box set. I don't know where it is today. I don't have a VHS player anymore, so it doesn't matter. But I had that box set of all the Rocky movies. I hope and pray every one of you in here have seen those. But if not, here's what happens every time, over and over again. Whether it's Rocky fighting against an opponent, and he's up, and the opponent shows weakness, or sometimes even Rocky shows some weakness. Either way, the storyline is the same. It's like one moment, one of them shows a moment of weakness or pain, or they're hurt, or they're dazed for an instant. And that's the moment that the other one unleashes all of the energy that they have left. The other cinematic classic. Sweep the leg. Karate Kid. I just watched it again. I've probably seen it 200 times. But that's what's going on in that moment too, right? Daniel-san, he's got a bum leg. And so the other coach tells him, sweep the leg, go after the weakness. It surrounds us, and opposition, it intensifies amidst our vulnerability. And so the question that we have to ask, and the question that we have answered for us here in Nehemiah, is then how do we respond? What do we do when this opposition comes? Because it's not an if, it's a when. And so how do we respond? Do we say, I think, which is maybe the greatest temptation that we face, oh, okay, I see what's going on here, and I guess now's not the time. Now's not the time to do what God's called me to do. Things are getting difficult. I think that's a huge temptation. When you look at the theme that we've been tracing through the book of Nehemiah, and we've said that you and I, all of us, we're called to give our surrounding community, this 300,000 approximate group of people that surround us, an opportunity to respond to an invitation to grow in a relationship with Jesus. And as soon as we take our first steps in that direction, we're going to face opposition from all sides that appear to every natural eye as insurmountable. And so the greatest temptation for us would be to say, I guess now's not the time. Nehemiah doesn't say that. It's not what Nehemiah does. It's not what Moses or Joshua or any of them did. Let's look at how Nehemiah responds. So if you read through this chapter, I'm going to give you some verses here to show you this pattern. Here's how Nehemiah responds. First, we see the opposition in verse 1 through 3. We read that. Then, verse 4 through 5, we see a prayer, right? Verse 4, hear, O our God, for we are despised. He begins praying as a response to that opposition. And then in verse 6, it's faith in action. And then we see a cycle begin to repeat. Again in verse 7 through 8, we see opposition again. And then in verse 9, we see prayer upon a foundation of faith. Again, verse 10 through 12, opposition amidst that vulnerability that we discussed. Verse 13 and 14 are faith and action in response to their prayer. The rest of the chapter, verse 15 through 23, faithful action based on the foundation of prayer. And then in verse 20, our God will fight for us. Our God will fight for us. As they rebuilt with one hand, they had their weapons in another. And with their mouths, they said, our God will fight for us. What a picture. We ask the question in our lives, what does it look like to respond to the inevitable and insurmountable opposition? We look at Nehemiah and we see three things. One is we fight against opposition with prayer. We fight against opposition with prayer. It's all over this book, right? We saw it in chapter 1. We saw it through chapter 2, here in 4. It's all over this book. Nehemiah responding in prayer. And what we have to realize, you and I, as we're in this place and as we find ourselves at the bottom of that snowball, that a lack of prayer in our life is the greatest demonstration of a lack of faith in our lives. You see, where faith is present, prayer grows. This relationship between faith and prayer, it's an amazing relationship. We see it not only here in Nehemiah chapter 4, but in our lives. It's so intertwined. And so the first thing we said, we fight against opposition with prayer, but second, we fight against opposition with faith. So the relationship of these two together, prayer is a demonstration of faith, while faith pushes us to prayer. Does that make sense? Prayer is a demonstration of our faith. In other words, if we believe God is all-powerful, that He is the God who takes care of His children, if He is sovereign, well, then we will turn to Him and cry out in prayer. It's a demonstration of our belief of who He is. That prayer, though, that prayer, those words that we cry out, they are faith growing. And so you have this cycle here that's beautiful. It's something only our God could create, that our faith then sparks our prayer, and that prayer then grows our faith. And all of that coming together takes us to this point on the journey down the road where we look back and we have an answer to why, God, were you taking me through that? Just to grow your faith, to put myself on display. How do we respond? We respond against the opposition with prayer. We respond against the opposition with faith. Chapter 1, verse 11. Listen to the faith in this. God gives success to your servant today. Faith in His provision, right? You hear it. God gives success to your servant today. Nehemiah was praying knowing that success was in God's hands. Chapter 2, verse 20. The God of heaven will make us prosper. You hear it in his words, the faith. Faith in his provision and his victory. In chapter 4, verse 20, simply stated, the words we just read, our God will fight for us. Is it up to us? Was it up to them? Was it up to Nehemiah? The opposition seemed insurmountable. We're surrounded. There's no way out of this. God will fight for us. The one who called us will fight for us. We fight against opposition with prayer. We fight against opposition with faith. And we fight against opposition with action. Chapter 4, verse 16. From that day on, half of my servants worked on construction, and half held the spears, shields, and bows. Or maybe my favorite phrase in this chapter, verse 6. We see the opposition. Nehemiah writes, so we built the wall. Isn't that beautiful? Sanballat, all these guys are jeering against him. Nehemiah writes about it, right, in the opening chapter 4 that we just read, and all this opposition, and what does Nehemiah say? So we built the wall. We did what God called us to do. That's what he's saying. In the face of insurmountable opposition, in the face of the pouring difficulty, we responded in faith and prayer and action. And God fought for us. It was God's victory. Crossings Community Church, wherever you are in this journey of your own home, your personal life, the marriage, parenting, finances, wherever you are in that place and you're feeling that opposition, you're feeling what Nehemiah felt, and you are surrounded by things that it feels like you can never defeat. Prayer, faith, together growing your picture of who our amazing God is, him growing inside of you, overwhelming your heart, and then action. Obedience, staying the course of doing what he's called us to do, what he's called you to do, to fight for that marriage or fight in that parenting relationship or continue to be biblical, God-exalting stewards of the finances that God's provided. Or church, where we are. All kinds of opposition around us with this amazing call that God's given us to move forward on church property. It would be easy for us to sit here and say, oh man, I guess now's not the time. Prayer, faith, action, rebuilding with one hand, a sword in the other, and a mighty God who's already accomplished victory for us. Would you pray with me? Father, thank you for who you are and what you've done for us. Thank you that your word is full of stories like Nehemiah that we can come to and that we can find encouragement. We can find you. We can find the way that you demonstrate yourself to us and to those around us. We can find strength because you are who you've always been. In the same way that you were strong enough for Moses and Joshua and Nehemiah, you are strong enough for us and everything that we're going through today. Everything that we will face. So God, I pray today over every story represented in this room. God, I realize I don't even know a fraction of what's going on in the homes here. But you do. You know every little piece of the story in this building this morning. You know every single ounce of opposition. And Father, you've already defeated it. And so God, I ask today that these homes in here, they would feel the encouragement of your victory. Father, that they would fight as Nehemiah's men did, with action, faith, prayer, and a sword ready to battle against the opposition that rises against them. And Father, today I just pray for your church here at Crossings Community Church. We would be a people, we would be a church that rises up in prayer and faith, battling against the opposition against us. God, may we be known as a church built of homes that pursues this community having an opportunity to experience a growing relationship with you, making your name known, making your name great, not the name of a church, but your gospel. Father, I pray anyone in here who doesn't know you this morning and they hear the hope that we talk about that exists amidst these pouring situations in life, God, give them the courage to come and ask me or anyone up on the front row. Come and talk to us. Come and find out what it means to be in a relationship with you, to have hope, to have salvation.